Everybody to the third OCBS DIRI lecture this year. Today's lecturer is myself. I will be giving a talk called Anuruddha and Mahā-Kaccāna, Tracing the Contours of Two Early Buddhist Lineages. So this is the last of the current series, and we'd like to thank the Dhamacaya International Research Institute for their support and helping us set up and get these lectures going. This is being live streamed to YouTube, so if you do not wish for yourself to be seen on YouTube, please turn off your video and keep your audio off until the questions at the end. If you would like to ask a question, please send a message to Stephen in chat, or else just put a hand up in the question time at the end. So I'm Alexander Wynne. I am affiliated to the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies. I'm a former student of Professor Richard Gombrich, and my expertise is early Buddhism, the history of early Buddhist thought and Buddhist literature. In this lecture today, I would like to, I'll be looking at the material on two chief disciples of the Buddha, Anuruddha and Mahā-Kaccāna, the information on them that is contained in the Pali canon, particularly the suttas. I'm not just going to be doing this, to compile the information and to try to learn what their characters are, because I think that's fairly clear. It's easy to find out. What I want to do is to try and use this material to understand something better about the formation of early Buddhism. So I have two questions in mind in particular. First is, how was the canonical literature formed? The Tipitaka, how did that come about? It was a massive effort and a great amount of creativity went into creating this. How did they do it? So that's the first question. The second question is more sort of fundamental. How was early Buddhist thought formed? What is the underlying structure of early Buddhist thought? And by that, I mean the basic structure, which is defined by the ideas of karma, rebirth, and nirvana, escape from rebirth. So karma and rebirth and its transcendence. This sort of defines the structure of Buddhist thought in all historical periods, in all Buddhist cultures. This is what could be called the Buddhist episteme. It's a way of thinking, a way of knowing that delimits the range of discourse in any particular culture. So I'm taking this idea of an episteme from Michel Foucault, as discussed by the Sinhalese anthropologist Gananath Obeyesekere in his book Karma and Rebirth. And according to Obeyesekere, the basic character, the Buddhist episteme formed in the early period is karma, rebirth, and its transcendence. And it seems almost redundant to point this out, but Buddhists have not been able really to think beyond this structure. So I would like to understand how this came about. The obvious answer is that, well, it came from the Buddha's own teachings, and that may be true. But I think in the formation of these ideas and the formation of texts about them, there are still some more things to be learned. So mostly what I will say now will bear on the idea of canonical formation, the creation, composition, and transmission of texts. At the end, I will try to bring it together more fundamentally in terms of how this bears on what I'm calling the Buddhist episteme. To start with then, well, just let me share my screen. So to start with, I just, in terms of the formation of Buddhist canonical literature, we have, of course, the account of the early Buddhist council. So we have the first council shortly after the Buddha's death, and then the second council maybe between 60 to 80 years after the Buddha. I think most scholars tend to think that the account of the first council is largely legendary, has a sort of legendary or mythic appearance. But the account of the second council seems to be relating to certain disputes that have a sense of things that actually happened. Now, if the first council is what happened, then okay, that would be fine. After the Buddha died, everybody got together and recited his teachings that they'd remembered. But actually, early Buddhist texts tell us that things were not quite so simple. Let me just bring up the next slide. So in the Digha Nikaya, and also in a couple of suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, we have a text on what is called the Four Great Authorities. So this text goes, this is the Buddha, apparently in the period before his death, saying, suppose a bhikkhu were to say, in such and such a monastery, the Sangha resides with its elders and leaders. I have heard and received this directly from that Sangha. This is the Dhamma, this is the Vinaya, this is the teacher's instruction. Bhikkhus, that statement should neither be approved nor rejected. Without approving or rejecting it, those words and phrases should be carefully learned and then placed alongside the discourses and compared with the discipline. So this is a fairly well-known text about the Buddha giving advice about how to deal with certain traditions that have sprung up about his teaching. Now, if we look at this, seems to me to be a fairly realistic overview of what must have happened, is that there must have been a huge variety of creation of early Buddhist texts, and there must have been monastic centers that vetted them. So some bhikkhu would come in, he would recite a text, say, I've heard it from here. The learned bhikkhus of that monastery would consider it against the canon that they're forming or has formed, and accept or reject or maybe do something to it. So the process which is being imagined here is a gradual accumulation of texts through a sort of outlying traditions from around the early Buddhist world, coming into a major monastic center and reporting texts. So what about these traditions that would have existed in early Buddhism? Can we know anything about them? What about figures like Anuruddha and Mahā-Kaccāna? Were the traditions associated with these figures that composed texts? And were these texts then put into a canon as it was being formed? Now, when we're talking about early Buddhist traditions, really what we're talking about is lineages. Early Buddhists think in terms of their lineage, tracing their teachers, their preceptors back in a series all the way to the Buddha. And Buddhist literature and epigraphic evidence has left a fair amount of information about lineages like this. So we have 5 Buddhist lineages here. The 3 at the top are entirely within texts, and the 2 at the bottom are from a fairly recently discovered inscription in northern India. All of the 3 lineages at the top, from the Mula Sarvastivadins, the Pali, and the Mahāsanghikas, are associated with Vinaya, with the Vinaya portion of the Vinaya called Skandaka. And they generally, well, the Mula Sarvastivadin and the Mahāsanghica have a lineage of about, I think they have a lineage of 5 names, which is meant to bridge the gap between the first and the second council. The Pali lineage is meant to be, is 6 names, which is meant to bridge the gap from the Buddha. Well, if we include the Buddha, it's 7 names, from the Buddha to the time of Ashoka, which is maybe 50 or more years longer than the other 2 lineages. But here we are, the names of early Buddhists recorded for posterity. Now, the lineages at the bottom from inscriptions of Deya Kota in northern India seem to belong to a local Buddhist tradition. The second one is interesting for my purposes because it traces itself back to Anuruddha and through him back to the Buddha. So these images come from a site called DIRI, which is about 90 miles southeast of the old site of Kosambi, a major Buddhist center. The lineages, the inscriptions belong roughly to the Shunga period, that is to say, the 2nd century BC. And the paleography apparently is more or less in line with the local paleography of Kosambi. So we're dealing with the Kosambi tradition and its outlying areas. According to the editors of the recent editors of these lineages, Solomon and Marino, in the first lineage, there would have been about 12 or 13 names mentioned, which would cover a period of about maybe 200 years. The second lineage maybe would have had about 14 names. So some of these have been lost with erosion on the inscription, which is contained upon a pillar. So just to put this into context, the oval area on the top right is the basic geographical area covered in most of the early Buddhist suttas and Vinaya, stretching in from Savatthi in the northwest to Rajagaha in the southeast. That is where the Buddha's teachings are set. So we can see to the west of this area, the southwest more or less, directly more or less from Varanasi, we have the center of Kosambi. And about 90 miles southeast of that, we have DIRI, roughly within the Chetī kingdom. The other oval area I have put onto this map the city of Mathura and the Avanti kingdom. So we have two areas really. We have the area of Mahā-Kaccāna to the west and the standard area, the standard geography of early Buddhism to the northeast. Just before going into the details of the Pali traditions about Anuruddha, I just want to give an idea of how the material in the Pali canon can be very stereotypical and, fairly follows fairly regular formats. So one format is when you have a large group of disciples and you put them together, there is a specific ranking. Sariputta is always the first. He's the chief disciple of the Buddha, and paired with him is Mahā-Moggallana. After that, we have a series of famous disciples, Mahā-Kassapa and Mahā-Kaccāna. If we go further towards the end, we have Anuruddha and Ananda. They are both Sakyas and regarded by tradition as being brothers and cousins of the Buddha. So this is from the Anapanasati Sutta, the introduction. The Buddha is in Savatthi. He's with a number of his well-known disciples, and they are teaching groups of young bhikkhus in different groupings. If we look at the Vinaya, we have more or less the same list of disciples, although strangely we lack Mahā-Kassapa, and in his place we have two more Sakyas. We have Upali and Rahula. So this is a type of stereotypical material on the disciples of the Buddha that we get in the Pali Suttas. And of course, what we find is that they all have particular specialities. So Sariputta is the man of wisdom. Moggallana is the great performer of supernatural powers. Kassapa is the ascetic. Anuruddha has the divine eye. He is able to see across the universe and to see beings in different stages, different levels or strata of the cosmos. What this means is that he has lots of encounters with supernatural beings. Apart from this, we have some non-standard, non-mythic type material on the disciples of the Buddha. So we have the testimony of the bhikkhu Sumana, who is recorded in his testimony as being the novice of Anuruddha. So this poem in the Therigatha states that Anuruddha is Sumana's Upajjhaya. Two more disciples of Anuruddha include Bahya and Abhinjika. So in the first source on Bahya, the setting is Kosambi, the Gositarama, and we have a problem. The Buddha asked Ananda if a legal case had been settled. Ananda says that Anuruddha's disciple, or somebody within Anuruddha's tradition, called Bahya, is committed, he's bent on schism. But Anuruddha doesn't think a single word should be said about it. Now, the Buddha then says to something like to Ananda, he says, well, what do you expect? Anuruddha doesn't get involved in these things. It's you and Sariputta who should sort it out. The setting for the next extract is Rajagaha, the bamboo grove. And so the Buddha tells Kassapa to teach the Dhamma. Kassapa replies that the bhikkhus are a bit troublesome and hard to teach. And apparently we have a disciple of Ananda called Banda is sort of in dispute with a disciple of Anuruddha called Abhinjika. In the Pali Canon, in the suttas and the Vinaya, there's a fair amount of material about disputes at Buddhist centers in Kosambi. And it's interesting that Anuruddha and Ananda, two brothers, are the main disciples of the Buddha who are associated with the Buddhist traditions of Kosambi. So here we seem to have a situation where disciples of these two figures, Ananda and Anuruddha, are in dispute. So as I just mentioned then, Anuruddha is especially associated with Kosambi and the Cheti kingdom. And we see this in two suttas in particular. So the first, the Upakilesa Sutta, the Buddha is in Kosambi, there are disputes, and so he leaves. He then goes off and meets another bhikkhu called Bhagu, who he teaches, before going off to visit Anuruddha and his meditative group, two more Sakyas, Nandya and Kimbila, in the Eastern Bamboo Park. So what the Buddha says here fits the context of a sort of a background of dispute and disharmony in the traditions of Kosambi. The Buddha asks Anuruddha, are you living in harmony? Are you rejoicing together? Are you blending like milk and water? And then the Buddha goes on to ask, are you living diligently? And have you attained any supernatural attainments, any superhuman distinction in knowledge and vision? So this, the text, the Upakilesa Sutta, it seems to, the context of this sort of fits the Kosambi scene. Kosambi is associated with dispute. The Buddha asks if everything is sort of okay with Anuruddha's group. Are they in harmony or not? Now, another important sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. So Anuruddha and his group, well, just Anuruddha on his own, he is in the same place, the Eastern Bamboo Park. The Buddha is nearby. It's not too far away. But the Buddha appears supernaturally in front of Anuruddha and teaches him. So I will discuss that teaching a bit further on. But then after the teaching, the Buddha tells Anuruddha, for the next rainy season, you should say right here in the land of the Chetis. in the Eastern Bamboo Park. So we have a text which is, by the tradition of the Buddha, is locating Anuruddha in this place in the Cheti kingdom. Apart from Cheti, the other prominent center associated with Anuruddha is Vaisali. So in the Chula Gasinga Sutta, the Buddha is staying in the brick house near Vaisali, and Anuruddha and his meditation group are now in the Gosingasal forest. Now it looks like this sutta has borrowed from the Upakilesa Sutta, because it has exactly some of the same narrative about how the Buddha visits them, what he asks the same people, but the context of dispute doesn't seem to fit. Dispute fits the context of Kosambi. It doesn't quite work in the sutta set in Vaisali. So it looks a little bit more artificial. However, it's important for establishing a sort of tradition associated with Anuruddha, because towards the end, we have the appearance of a local spirit, a yaka, called Diga Parajana, who says that the Vajjis are fortunate that Anuruddha and his group stay among them. And then, this is a sort of like a super, Diga Parajana calls out across the universe, and his voice resounds all the way up to the Brahma heavens. Everybody gets to hear this. And then the Buddha follows this up by saying that if anybody from Anuruddha's family or Anuruddha's village or town, country, city, if any of them have faith in Anuruddha, it will benefit them in the long run. Now, this sort of looks to me like an attempt to associate the Anuruddha tradition with a local sort of tradition in and around Vaisali. So we have the sort of divine, supernatural approval of the local yaka, Diga Parajana, and the Buddha saying that the people here, they should be glad that this tradition is located here. So apart from Anuruddha's location, I will come back to that. I mentioned then that Anuruddha is regarded as renowned for his ability, his supernatural ability of having divine vision. So he states this in the Mahā-Kaccāna Sutta. Anuruddha states that the ideal bhikkhu is somebody who can survey 1,000 worlds. So this leads to a number of texts where Anuruddha has sort of encounters, supernatural encounters with various spirits or deities or whatever. So in the Samyutta Nikaya, one of them is, we see Ananda's divine vision in action. He sees women, specifically women, going to heaven and hell. And he asks the Buddha, why is this? And the Buddha explains the process of karma. The good karma that sends women to heaven and the bad karma that sends them to hell. In the Anguttara Nikaya, Anguttara 846, we have a number of deities coming to perform a sort of sexual dance in front of Anuruddha. And they change color according to his thoughts. And of course, he is rather shy and just looks away. In Samyutta 9.6, Anuruddha's former wife, not his ex-wife, I don't think he was divorced. I mean to say his wife had died. Apologies. So his former wife has passed away. His wife has passed away and been reborn in the Tava Tingsa heaven. And she tries to tempt Anuruddha to be reborn there. But he says it's too late. He has done what had to be done. He is an arahant. He has no more birth. And so finally, just another example of Anuruddha's supernatural encounters. In the morning, just before dawn, Anuruddha is reciting some stanzas of the Dhamma, and then a yaka hears this, and the yaka tells its child to listen and practice in accordance with this, because this is how to get out of being trapped in the state of a goblin. So apart from this material about Anuruddha, where he has these supernatural encounters, this, of course, implies that he is some sort of meditation master. And the scheme of meditation that he is most connected with is the four jhanas. So notably in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, it is Anuruddha and Ananda, two brothers, two Sakyas. They are the only chief disciples immediately on the scene. They witness the Buddha's death. They see the Buddha dying. Ananda thinks the Buddha has died in the state of cessation. Anuruddha connects him and says, no, he's not dead yet. And then the Buddha goes back down and dies in the fourth jhana. There is a very interesting sutta that hasn't been paid nearly enough attention to in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Nalakapana Sutta, where we have Anuruddha as the lead monk of a group of monks which is mostly made up of Sakyas, but there are a couple of Brahmins in there. Anyway, in this text, the initial discussion is about the joy and bliss distinct from bad states. I mean, our Anuruddha is a passive recipient in this discussion with the Buddha. And the Buddha talks initially about this type of jhanic state and the hindrances, a non-standard list of hindrances which prevents it being attained. And then in Anguttara 830, one of these suttas set in Chedi, the Cheti kingdom, the Buddha teaches Anuruddha the four jhanas and connects them to the four ascetic requisites. And he says things like this, that when you can attain the four jhanas, it will just be like a householder with a mansion plastered inside and out, sheltered from the wind, with close-fitting windows and doors shut tight. That's what your dwelling at the root of a tree will seem. So a very poetic exposition of the four jhanas and the type of lifestyle they lead to, given by the Buddha to Anuruddha in Cheti. Because Anuruddha has this type of supernatural ability to see across different worlds, he gets connected with cosmology. So in the Upakilesa Sutta, which I just mentioned, the Buddha gives a list of 7 meditations, which are clearly a sort of riff on the four jhanas. We basically have all of the ideas of the four jhanas here in a slightly unusual, I think, unique statement in the Pali canon, but it's basically the four jhanas. Now, apart from that, in this sutta, the Buddha asks Anuruddha, as you live diligently, and do you attain any superhuman distinction in knowledge and vision? Anuruddha replies that, living like this, we perceive radiance and visions of forms. But that radiance soon disappears, as does the visions of forms. We have not penetrated the nimitta. Now, this might look like some sort of mention of nimitta meditation, an object of meditation. But actually, this type of construction in Pali, I think the word nimitta has a meaning of the cause or the reason of something. Nothing is actually stated about meditation objects. Be that as it may, perceiving radiance and having visions of forms certainly must relate the meditations of Anuruddha to his cosmic vision. So perceiving radiance and having visions, such visions like this, are related to the arrival somewhere of deities. We get that in the Kevata Sutta, and we get it in a Anguttara Sutta 864, where the Buddha talks about his practice as a bodhisattva in exactly these ways. And then the Buddha learns how to master his meditation so that the radiance and the forms don't disappear, and that he ends up having conversations with deities. So the Upakilesa Sutta implies a sort of cosmological way of thinking. Anuruddha is doing meditations which are related to sort of cosmic visions. Finally, I will just mention the Chula Gasinga Sutta, which seems to borrow the narrative of the Upakilesa Sutta. But anyway, when the Buddha in this sutta asks, do you have any superhuman distinction in knowledge and vision? Anuruddha says, yes, we do. We've attained the 4 jhanas, the 4 formless states, and the state of cessation. So now, obviously, with the 4 formless states, they're correlated to cosmic strata. So in these suttas, Anuruddha's spiritual practice is related to some sort of cosmic vision. Finally, I just should mention that there is the Anuruddha Sangyutta in the Sangyutta Nikaya relates Anuruddha to Satipatthana. These suttas are sort of standard, but they seem to be derivative. So the first of them seems to borrow from the Indriya Bhavana Sutta, the final sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. But anyway, what these suttas are sort of saying is that Anuruddha has mastered the Satipatthanas. He advises them for trainees and for adepts. And by doing this, he attains lots of different supernatural powers. So in summary then, this is what we have on Anuruddha. So he has, like our inscriptions from Dea Kotar say, the main connection is with Kosambi, the Cheti kingdom. So these Buddhist traditions of Kosambi and Cheti are strongly associated with the 2 brothers, Ananda and Anuruddha. There is also a connection between Anuruddha and the Gosinga Sal forest near Vesali. It looks secondary, but it is a firm attempt has been made to situate Anuruddha here. Apart from this, Anuruddha is connected with all the major meditative schemes in the canon, the jhanas, satipatthana, and formless meditation. That isn't so surprising, but the jhanas seem to be primary, whereas formless meditation and satipatthana seem to be secondary. And then finally, Anuruddha's divine ability with divine vision. He can see across 1,000 worlds. This sort of idea is expressed in a number of texts involving interactions with deities. And the attainment of the divine eye also implies a cosmological way of thinking. So that is Anuruddha, the meditations, the places, the cosmological connection to his name, to his tradition. So that's what I think we must be dealing with here. I will try to draw this out a bit more, but I think these texts are pretty much like what I said at the beginning, the 4 great authorities. You have a central monastery, texts coming into it, being recited to the bhikkhus there, who compare them with the text that they have. And so this is how a tradition, such as the traditions about Anuruddha, would get built up. And now moving on to Mahā-Kaccāna, we have an entirely different geographical location. We have the western city of Madura and the Avanti kingdom. So most of the time that Mahā-Kaccāna appears in the canon, he is in these places, which is interesting because within the canon, I don't think the Buddha goes to Avanti, at least in the suttas. And I think in the suttas, the Buddha only is located in Madura once. So this is very much a frontier region, generally beyond the early Buddhist world. Now, apart from that, Kaccāna has very little contact with the Buddha as stated in the suttas. So we have two Sangyutta suttas where Kaccāna receives a teaching from the Buddha. And then we have two highly stereotypical suttas in the Udana where Kaccāna is mentioned by the Buddha. He's mentioned in a text, Udana 7.8, in which it's a very stereotypical framework about the Buddha points to Kaccāna and says, look at Kaccāna meditating over there. Now, the same framework is applied to Sariputta, Moggallana, Mahā-Kaccāna, etc. So Kaccāna's actual contact with the Buddha is highly stereotyped, whereas mostly he's in suttas where the Buddha never goes. So just to remind you that is this western region here from Mathura to Avanti. So Kaccāna, unlike Anuruddha, is not particularly associated with a cosmic type of vision or anything supernatural. He is instead connected with texts and the analysis of Buddha Vachana. So there are a number of texts introduced where somebody says, this has been spoken by the Blessed One. And then they say, in text X, Y, Z. So in the Atthakavagga, in the questions of Margandya, in the questions of Sakka, in the Digha Nikaya, in the questions of Kumari, the Buddha says this. What does the Buddha mean? And then Kaccāna says, well, you should have asked the Buddha. And then he says, well, okay, if you push me, then this is what they mean. So Kaccāna is associated with a specific textual corpus, which I suppose you could define all of these texts which are associated with Kaccāna as texts to do with the sort of apophatic tradition in early Buddhist thought, the no-view type of way of thinking where the Buddha doesn't answer certain questions. That's what the sort of thing that Kaccāna analyzes. Just the final text mentioned here, Udana 5.6, also repeated in the Vinaya. This is very important because the monk Sona Kutikana, he comes from the West as well. He is ordained by Kaccāna. Kaccāna is his upajjhaya. He travels to see the Buddha. He stays the night meditating with the Buddha out in the open. And then at dawn, the Buddha asks him to recite. And he recites the entire Atthakavagga, at which point the Buddha praises his style of enunciation. So again, Kaccāna doesn't visit the Buddha himself. Someone in his lineage does. And that lineage is reported to go to the center of the Buddhist world, Savatthi, and recite a text. Mahā-Kaccāna then, as somebody who analyzes Buddha Vachana, we have three important texts from the Majjhima Nikaya, where you have a fairly brief Buddha Vachana, and then Kaccāna explains it. All of these explanations are sort of given as like philosophical, analytical expositions of consciousness and cognition. So the same is, you get the same phenomenon in the Samyutta Nikaya, and only in the Anguttara Nikaya you have something slightly different, where the subject of analysis is moral principles. But the basic format is the same. A Buddha Vachana is presented to Kaccāna, and Kaccāna, kept very formally distinct in the text, in the narrative from the Buddha, then gives his explanation. Now, within these Majjhima Suttas, we basically have a sort of connection. If we look at the implications of meditation, it seems to imply mindfulness and the jhanas. So rather than Anuruddha's cosmic type of vision, in the Madhupindika Sutta, the teaching that Kaccāna analyzes is about the cognitive source of mental proliferation. In other words, basic primary experience. In the Mahā-Kaccāna Bhaddeka Ratta Sutta, we have a few verses from the Buddha on living in the moment. One should not chase after the past, nor place expectations on the future. What is past is left behind, and the future has not yet arrived. So again, completely different from the cosmic vision of Anuruddha. This is all about cognition, consciousness in the here and now. So finally, the Udesa Vibhanga Sutta is really important for meditation. So we see here the statement, the Buddha Vachana given is a bhikkhu should examine in such a way that his consciousness is neither scattered externally nor fixed internally. Being without grasping, he would not tremble. And this is the end of suffering. Just this type of experience. Kaccāna explains not scattering externally as not grasping onto external cognitive objects of cognition. And not being fixed internally means having the four jhanas, but not grasping onto them. So in Kaccāna's practice, we seem to have this jhanic mindfulness type of implication. We have the jhanas specifically stated, but also with regard to external cognition, it's a sort of mindful thing where you do not grasp at experience. Now, I am running out of time here, but we started late, so I will push on a little bit. We have a few other sort of strange things connected with Kaccāna. So a couple of things in the Anguttara Nikaya. At Anguttara 1025, you have a standard teaching on the 10 spheres of totality, the 10 kasinas. And then immediately after that, Kaccāna criticizes them. He says that this is not the purpose, and the Buddha knows and sees what is the path and what is not the path. Sort of implies that you have, when should you go and see your teacher? Well, you should do that when you have problems with the 5 hindrances, or when you have a problem about the object of meditation. Interestingly, the teaching given by Kaccāna, explains how to deal with this, but it doesn't give any type of nimitta. It doesn't explain nimitta meditation. It just gives an explanation in teaching about the 5 corruptions. And so finally, we have the 6 recollections, the Buddha, the Dhamma, Sangha, the triple jewel, along with virtue giving and the deities. These are 6 recollections which are really not in fitting with the character of Kaccāna, as we've seen already. But there you have one text. Okay, just finally, you have these two suttas where you have the name Kaccāna mentioned. So you have the Kaccāna Gota Sutta, where the Buddha gives a teaching. This is one of the teaching suttas where Kaccāna receives a teaching. And it's really one of the most advanced philosophical formulations in the Pali Canon. The notions of existence and non-existence are said to be contingent. But in this, the Buddha, this is called the Kaccāna Gota Sutta. So a slight change of name, which is a little bit unprecedented in the rest of the Pali Canon. And then finally, we have this figure, Mahā-Kaccāna, who pops up in a couple of suttas. And he deals with Vajragota, who asks him about the unanswered questions about the Tathagata's fate. So Mahā-Kaccāna is somebody who deals with exactly the same type of thought as Mahā-Kaccāna. And I don't know what this means. It's not stated. Maybe this is somebody within the Kaccāna tradition generally, or his lineage. I don't know. Anyway, it is the same type of thought that you find associated with Kaccāna. So in summary then, Mahā-Kaccāna is situated distantly from the early Buddhist world in Avanti and Madura. Kaccāna hardly ever appears alongside the Buddha. Usually he analyzes Buddha Vachana without any direct contact with the Buddha. Kaccāna's tradition is associated with the apophatic tendency in early Buddhism, the no-view type of Buddhist teaching, which you find in texts such as the Atthakavagga. And then this tradition, I think, is really the precursor to the Prajna Paramita. This tradition is associated, I'd say, fairly strongly with mindfulness and jhana, seems to critique the practice of meditating on objects, and doesn't really have any much cosmic dimension to it. It's all about experience in the here and now. Now, as for Kaccāna Gota, the names Kaccāna Gota and Mahā-Kaccāna, it's difficult to know what that means, maybe figures within the Kaccāna traditional lineage. But anyway, they seem to carry on the same type of apophatic thought associated with Mahā-Kaccāna. So what does this mean then for wider conclusions then about the formation of the Buddhist canon? Well, what we have fairly consistently with the figures of Anuruddha and Mahā-Kaccāna is a couple of different, distinct early Buddhist traditions. They're differentiated in terms of location, probably chronology, although they're meant to be disciples of the Buddha, and also their doctrinal focus. So Anuruddha, his association with the lifetime of the Buddha is strong. It's him and Ananda who are on the scene when the Buddha dies. He has a very firm connection with the Sakyas. He is a Sakya. Kaccāna is a Brahmin from the West. This is not an area that really belongs in the early Buddhist world, but it is an area which accounts of the Second Council talk about. So Anuruddha is associated with a visionary or a cosmological way of thinking, and Kaccāna with cognition and experience in the here and now. So the question with regard to the formation of early Buddhist thought and texts which enshrine that thought, are these two perspectives compatible? Are they fundamentally different? Or are they possibly even antagonistic? Now, just to conclude that, give some sort of answer to that question, we have the Anuruddha Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. So in the Anuruddha Sutta, it's very interesting for this question of, do we have two streams of thought? Because we have Anuruddha and Mahā-Kaccāna, both appear in this text. Anuruddha is having a dialogue with somebody from the royal court of Savatthi, some Panchakanga, who is a carpenter or architect. And he asks about the limitless release of mind and the expansive release of mind. He thinks they're the same, and then Anuruddha said, no, they're very different. The limitless release of mind consists of the Brahma Viharas. The expansive release of mind is as follows. So a bhikkhu meditates, this is Anuruddha giving the teaching. A bhikkhu meditates at the foot of a tree, focusing on successively expanded spheres. So starting with 1, 2, or 3 trees, then moving on to 1, 2, or 3 village parishes, followed by 1, 2, or 3 kingdoms, and finally the earth bounded by the ocean. Now then, after this, Anuruddha jumps onto a different type of thing. He says, meditating on 4 types of radiance leads to rebirth among gods with that type of radiance. So these gods have different levels of radiance. He says they have different colors. If you meditate on them, on their radiance, if their radiance is limited, unlimited, if it's sullied or pure, then you end up in a cosmic realm matching that type of radiance. So this is entirely in keeping with Anuruddha's cosmic type of meditation. But then what we have is Mahā-Kaccāna questions it. He questions this fourfold definition of deities, asking about the limits of the deity's radiance and its quality. The tone is skeptical. So Mahā-Kaccāna appears in this text as a skeptic. Anuruddha explains that the type of deity rebirth and the type of radiance you get depends upon how expansive your meditation had been in life and what the quality of radiance had been due to the quality of your meditation. So Anuruddha is explaining his cosmic vision, and then we get this very sarcastic applause from Kaccāna. Kaccāna is reported to say, good Venerable Anuruddha. Venerable Anuruddha does not say, thus have I heard, or thus it ought to be. Rather, sir, Venerable Anuruddha says, such is this deity, such is that deity. It occurs to me, sir, that surely Venerable Anuruddha must have previously lived with those deities and discussed and conversed with them. Anuruddha replies, certainly, Venerable Kaccāna, your words were spoken in an offensive and provocative way. But I will explain it to you. For a long time, Venerable Kaccāna, I had previously lived with those deities and conversed and discussed with them. So with this, I think what we're getting is that when we gather together everything about Anuruddha, and gather the sort of things connected to the tradition of Kaccāna, and they look really entirely different. We have almost 2 very different perspectives on what the Buddhist view of the world is. Different text, different location, different content. And then finally in the Anuruddha Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, we have this clash. I mean, Kaccāna is sort of, in a way, it's reassuring that you have some sort of modern sarcastic type of tone appearing in these early Buddhist texts. I find that reassuring because, you know, they were just humans like us. They had their own doubts just like us. But anyway, we have this clash of perspectives, and Anuruddha sort of takes offense but says, well, not to worry. This is true. I do have this type of cosmic experience. Now, in terms of the formation of the Buddhist canon and the formation of Buddhist thoughts, what does this mean? Well, it means we must have separate traditions occurring in different regions of the early Buddhist world. Of course, Buddhists are highly mobile, so it means that the networks connected to these traditions will be spread out, no doubt. But there are still distinct traditions involved in, must be involved in textual production. So local traditions connected to Kaccāna or connected to Anuruddha are producing texts of matching whatever their vision of Buddhism is, and they're being incorporated into the canon, the growing canon. It must be something like this. Now, what happens here is that how do you bridge the gap between the two visions? Can you bridge it? I mean, if you compare in the Pali canon, say two entirely different collections of texts, say the Atthakavagga and the Sutta Nipata, if you compare that to the Khandaka section of the Vinaya, which gives the account of the Buddha's formation of the Buddhist community, the two things are completely different. The Khandaka has this cosmic vision like that of Anuruddha. It's full of deities, it's full of miraculous events. It has nothing to do with the analysis of consciousness or cognition. It is one form, one stream, one way of thinking about Buddhism. If you look at the Atthakavagga, you have something very different. It's all about mindfulness, cognition, the nature of experience and reality as we experience it. In time, what we have connected to these two traditions reappears in the early Mahayana world in terms of the Prajnaparamita on the one hand, and the Pure Land tradition on the other. So the Pure Land is all about the cosmic vision, whereas the Prajnaparamita is much more about perfecting wisdom in the here and now. It is picking up the threads of the apophatic tradition. And this is a recurring thing happening in Buddhism henceforth. In China, you have the Chan tradition picking up Prajnaparamita, and of course, the great expansion of Pure Land Buddhism in East Asia. So in terms of the formation of the Buddhist, I will just conclude now, I'm slightly over time. In terms of the formation of the Buddhist canon, I think things are much more complicated than we imagine. I think we have evidence here that we've just looked at, which should best be viewed as local traditions producing texts connected to their tradition. How do they voice their view? They use as a mouthpiece their patron saint, which is the disciple their tradition stems from, who was associated with the Buddha. These things have to be incorporated into the canon. So the canon is, I would view it as a synthesis. If we go back to the Mahapadesas, the four great authorities, yes, of course, there must be some sort of comparison, but I think the parameters which have been set to compare these things are extremely broad. The suttas, the collection of suttas which is being formed is, to me, diverse and fairly broad in scope.